Chapter 7. Mr. Carpenter, said Countess Judy, delivered with the full force of the eyes, the most devastating modulation of the voice. It should have been enough to freeze him like a bucket of sweet corn. It explained why the Fae were reduced to fighting civil wars, since no external enemy would dare take the field against them. It was the goddess in her triple aspect as headmistress, unapproachable ice princess, and aunt. It didn't work. But you can't just leave them there, Paul protested, so loudly that they could probably hear him in the corridor. You've no idea what that place is like. Actually, she said, I have. I've been there myself. That was enough to shock him into silence. Oh, he said, after a brief token of acute embarrassment. Then he rallied and continued. In which case, you know how really, really bad it is in there, then? Exactly. Apart from her mouth, the Countess didn't move at all. Come to that, Paul could never remember having seen her blink. Not once. Like a painting. Which is why I sent you to rescue Mr. Shumway. And now, she went on, calm as a sea of mercury, you tell me that you were captured and barely managed to escape? Since you are the only member of the pest control team still at liberty, we would seem to have run out of options. I take it that you're not volunteering to try again. She had him there because he realized with a pang of shame nothing on earth would make him go back. The full force of it had only hit him when he'd woken up that morning. It had been dark, and for a split second, when he opened his eyes and couldn't see anything, he thought his rescue had just been a dream, and he was still down there. He'd been so scared, he hadn't been able to move for about 15 seconds. Well, it shouldn't be up to me, Paul said, defensive as a child who knows it's in the wrong. I'm only a trainee. I haven't got a clue how you're supposed to go about breaking out of magic dungeons. But you and Mrs. Suslovich and Professor Van Spee... Still, Countess Judy hadn't moved. At any other time, that would have been enough to freak Paul out on its own. You should know by now, she said, that heroism is entirely species-specific. Humans can be heroes, so under certain circumstances can dwarves, like Mr. Shumway. Giants, goblins, and the Fae, however, are explicitly excluded, on account, she added, with the ghost of a smile, of being officially classified as creatures of darkness. In other words, the enemy. That rules out Mr. Suslovich, Mr. Tanner, and myself. Professor Van Spee is 462 years old and suffers from chronic asthma. It's either you or nobody, Mr. Carpenter. I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do. Mr. Shumway knew the risks, likewise Mr. Wormtoter, although I notice you haven't mentioned him. In case you'd forgotten, he too was missing in action. As for Mrs. Wormtoter, your car, she was a fully qualified practitioner before her transformation, and doubtless entirely aware of the perils of her chosen career. Professionals, Mr. Carpenter, all three of them. We should honour their sacrifice and move on. Paul's anger didn't shrivel away as it would normally have done. To his great surprise, it crystallized into cold, hard determination, and he hid it in the back of his mind, where even the Countess couldn't see it. All right, he said. I see. Fine. I'm sorry for coming barging in here like this. A very slight shrug, maybe 1.5 degrees per shoulder. That's quite all right, Mr. Carpenter. Your reaction was entirely understandable and shows a laudable concern for the well-being of your colleagues. We pride ourselves on the team spirit here at J.W.W. And now, she said, I must ask you to put your recent experiences behind you. As will be obvious, the loss of our pest control department and our cashier places us in a most unfortunate position. We shall, of course, start advertising in the trade journals for suitable replacements. In the meanwhile, however, I am hoping very much that you will agree to mind the store, as I believe the expression is. It took a couple of seconds for that to sink in. Me, Paul whispered. Do the heroism and be the cashier. But I can't. I don't know how. Countess Judy raised her hand. My partners and I have every confidence in you, she said. Mr. Shumway was of the opinion that you were competent to practice as a pest control operative, or else he'd never have released you early from your in-service training program. We shall, of course, not undertake any major new commissions in that department until a full-time replacement has been found. However, I shall expect you to service all existing contracts in the interim and deal with emergencies for our regular clients. As for the cashier's job, I appreciate that you will require an assistant. I thought perhaps that our new receptionist, Ms. Horrocks, might be suitable. She has broad experience of office procedures according to her resume, and I'm sure Mr. Tanner's mother would be prepared to cover for her on reception. I'm aware that officially she's on maternity leave, but if she's fit enough to break into the dungeons of the Talmberg, she ought to be up to sitting behind a desk for a week or so. The outright refusal died on Paul's lips like a microwaved slug. Working with Melts, the two of them together. Admit it, he told himself. It'd be fun. It'd be, well, like old times, when he was sharing an office with Sophie, and that had been enough to make him want to get up and go to work in the mornings, even though he knew perfectly well that what awaited him there was weirdness, goblins, bewilderment, and fear. And Sophie, as he admitted it to himself, he squirmed. Sophie had never been half as much fun to be with as Melts. She'd never really been his friend. On the other hand, even he wasn't so naive as to think that Countess Judy would suggest something that he'd like without some ghastly, exploitative, ulterior motive. On the third hand, pretty soon his train of thought was going to have more hands than Shiva, but what the hell? Did that matter? Did it, hell? All right, Paul said. Yes, I think that's a great idea. After all, he added, it's only going to be for a week or so. Maybe a little longer, Countess Judy said softly. Clearly we'll be taking our time, making sure that we find the right people. You can't rush really important decisions, like who you're going to be working intimately with for the foreseeable future. Paul looked up and stared at her, then looked away in confusion. She had a way of saying intimately that made him feel like a 12-year-old boy trapped in a changing room with 30 extremely tall strippers. Yes, he said. I think you're absolutely right there. So let's do that. Fine. There was triumph and malice in her smile. Not bad going to fit so much into something so small. Perhaps you'd do me a favour and sound Ms. Horrocks out on the idea, she said, though I'm sure she'll have no objections. Well, yes, Paul thought, as he hurried down the corridor towards the front office. Yes, I've been suckered into doing 2 difficult, horrible jobs for no extra money, and yes, she was blatantly obvious about it, using Melts to bribe me with. Cool. And Benny and Monica and even Ricky Wormtoter, who was as weird as a blender full of hummingbirds, but who'd always been sort of nice to him. He shooed the thought away with the fly swatter of fatalism. If Countess Judy reckoned nothing could be done for them, she ought to know. They'd just have to stay there, locked away along with Sophie, in the dungeon in the basement of his memory where he stashed all the inconvenient guilt. I can't believe I'm doing this, he told himself. But himself was remembering the last time he'd had lunch with Melts, the way she had licked crumbs off the corner of her mouth, and thus wasn't in the mood to listen. She was answering the phone when he got there. She looked up and smiled, then carried on telling whoever it was that Mr. Tanner was out of the office at the moment, but would call him or her, or since it was Mr. Tanner and possibly a personal call, maybe it, right back as soon as he returned. Paul stood fidgeting, unable to decide on the exact choice of words, and as he waited, it suddenly occurred to him that maybe Melts wasn't going to be thrilled to bits and pieces at the thought of being stuck in the cashier's office all day, or at the prospect of working intimately with him. Hadn't thought of that, and neither, now he mentioned it, had Countess Judy, but it was a possibility, a distinct possibility. Hello, you, Melts said, as the phone clicked back on its cradle. Haven't seen you to talk to for ages. She was smiling, and the warmth in her eyes hit Paul like a chocolate bullet. He'd seen smiles like that, mostly aimed at other people, pointed at him, usually only when he was asleep. But this one was right up close. You could toast muffins over it. Been busy, he mumbled. Bloody work, you know. How are you getting on? She shrugged. It's all right, I guess. I mean, everybody's really nice and I'm not rushed off my feet and stressed out. It's okay, but, well, it can get a bit boring sometimes. I'm not complaining, but it'd be nice if there was a bit more to it, you know? Paul gulped at her for at least 2 seconds before he managed to figure out how his voice worked. Odd you should say that, he mumbled. How do you fancy helping me out in the cashier's office? She squeaked. Ooh, great, she said. I'd really like that. Then she frowned very slightly. What are you doing working in there, though? She said. I thought you were supposed to be learning about glamour and stuff. A change of plan, he croaked. Benny Shumway's on holiday for a bit, so I'm covering for him. And Countess Judy thinks I could use some help, which is absolutely true. Meltz's eyes sparkled. They were saying, thank you for choosing me. And of course, he couldn't tell her otherwise without sounding totally rude and ungracious. Fantastic, she said. Who'll be doing reception instead of me? Oh, let me guess. She twitched her nose. Old Red Eyes is back. Mr. Tanner's mum, who'd snatched Paul out of the dungeons of the Fae. He really ought to not snigger about her behind her back. He sniggered. That's all right, isn't it? He said. Absolutely, she said. Rather her than me. When do I start? Meltz was good at it too, though Paul was hardly surprised at that. She knew which box file the pink requisitions had to go in after they'd been stamped, and how to reconcile the green inter-office transfers with the end-of-day printouts, and which forms to use to record unused second-class stamps left over at the end of a VAT quarter. When he'd asked her how the hell she knew about that, she just grinned and said, magic. Paul spent the whole of the morning in the cashier's office. He'd justified it to himself by saying that he was hiding there, in case some client turned up downstairs wanting a dragon slain or a vampire staked. But he'd never had much luck with lying, least of all with lying to himself. Just spending time with her was wonderful, in a way that being with Sophie had never been. He felt relaxed, unguarded, happy. He could almost be himself and not have to worry about how woefully inadequate that made him feel. At 5-1, Meltz shut the ledger he'd ostensibly been explaining to her, although the flow of information had been going in entirely the opposite direction, and said firmly, Lunch. Not that Italian sandwich place. I'm buying. Fine, he murmured. Where were you thinking of? She pursed her lips slightly. Didn't you say there's a great little Uzbek place just round the corner? The one you went to with Mr. Wormtoter? Yes, but it's fiendishly expensive and really crowded. You haven't a hope of getting a table unless your grandfather booked one for you on the day your father was born, and I can't remember offhand where it is either. I like Uzbek food, she said briskly. Let's go. Paul led the way to the best of his recollection, until eventually Meltz grabbed his sleeve, took him back the way they'd just come, and kept going until they got there. As he'd anticipated, there was a queue almost out into the street, but she swept on past it, straight to a corner table, where the head waiter was waiting to take their order. She ordered Behili Pavlov for 2 and Kalinchi bread and a pot of Tashkent black tea, and while they were waiting for it to arrive, she brought Paul up to date with her life story. Most of it, apparently, seemed to be about boring jobs and useless boyfriends. It surprised Paul that someone who had so much going for her should have such a rotten time. Surely, if you were good-looking and bright and fun to be with, shouldn't the world do exactly what you wanted it to, like a well-trained dog? That had always been an article of faith, as far as he was concerned. His life had been a rolling sequence of disasters because he was an unsatisfactory mess, and if only he'd been better looking, smarter, cooler, more tanned, better dressed, things would have been entirely different. He hadn't objected to the system particularly, once he'd figured out how it seemed to work. On the contrary, knowing he'd never really stood a chance had been a comfort, an excuse for not trying. But if there was no such system, no such rules, things suddenly became alarmingly arbitrary, and by implication, if he hadn't managed to get the things he wanted, it was somehow his fault, rather than the responsibility of his parents and remoter ancestors, for landing him with a set of genes and a station in life that meant there was no point in bothering to aspire. While these 4 issues were whizzing through his mind in a sort of frantic Brownian motion, he kept nodding and making little sympathetic noises as Meltz embarked on an account of yet another disaster. Apparently, he was doing the right thing, because as she talked, she was looking at him with a warm, thoughtful glow in her eyes, like a predatory angel. And basically that's it, she said, and Paul, looking up with a mouthful of Behili Pavlov, concluded that the briefing was complete. So, she went on, that's all my gory details. How about you? He shrugged and swallowed rice. Oh, nothing to tell, really. I mean, like I told you, I've been here about 9 months now, and I suppose I'm sort of getting used to it. Split up with my girlfriend just before you arrived. She reckoned that she couldn't stand the sight of me anymore, and I guess I can see her point. That's all, really. Melts pulled a face. You have to do better than that, she said. Like, what are your plans for the future? Where do you reckon you're going? All that sort of thing. And don't say you don't know, because I don't believe you. I know what you're like, always the quiet one with loads going on just below the surface. For instance, I don't believe you just sort of drifted into this magic thing by sheer fluke and then found out you had the gift or whatever you call it straight out of the blue. Something like that. You must have known all along that you were different. Special. The correct answer was, of course, no. It wasn't the answer that Paul gave. Instead, he found himself hinting, implying, suggesting. In fact, if the impression he was giving was anything to go by, he was a pretty enigmatic and fascinating piece of work. Effective magic, commented a tiny little voice somewhere in the back of his mind. See, you can do it if you try. He was telling her what she wanted to hear, though, and surely that was a good thing? And then there came a moment when neither of them were talking. His hand was on the table. He wasn't sure how it got there, and slowly, deliberately, she reached out her hand toward it. He saw it and looked at her. She was staring, no, gazing at him, and he was caught in her regard like a rabbit in headlight beams. The pain shot up from his wrist into his elbow, from there to his shoulder. It was like various sorts of pain he'd actually experienced, and others he'd only imagined. Toothache, crushing, slicing, burning, stinging, electrocution, tearing, stabbing. It punched the air out of his lungs and stopped his heart for a second, until a reflex cut in and made him pull his hand away. The pain stopped immediately, though the shock lingered. His hand and arm were numb for a couple of seconds, and then the pins and needles set in. "What's the matter?" Mel said, and her voice was slightly panicky. Are you all right?" I'm fine," Paul snapped. Sorry, I just got this pain in my hand, like a twinge or something." Inside him, a little voice protested that if it had been a twinge, the First World War had been a slight difference of opinion. Cramp, he said. That's all." "Oh," she laughed. It sounded like a stone falling down a well. "That's all right, then. I thought, well, I'd upset you or something." It was only then that he realised she'd touched his hand. Shit, he thought. What a way to react. How unbelievably romantic. No, really, he bleated. "Like I said, it was just cramp. I get it sometimes, really," he added, in case there was any lingering ambiguity. "That's awful," she said sympathetically. "Sounds like one of those repetitive strain things. You should see a doctor." He did the martyr's can't-be-bothered shrug. "It's not so bad," he said. "It looked pretty nasty," Melts replied, looking slightly sideways at him. "If it is repetitive strain, what's it? You can have physiotherapy. They give you this sort of brace to wear. My aunt had it and they cleared it up in no time." Paul said. "I'll have to give that a try then." He was painfully aware that he was blushing like a beetroot. "I'm really sorry if I startled you," he said. "That's all right." She made a show of looking at her watch. "Damn, it's 10 to 2. We'd better be getting back." She looked up, and at once the waiter materialised like a Romulan cruiser declawking, and handed her the bill. She produced a card, apparently out of thin air, and he went away. "Well," she went on, "thanks ever so much for showing me the ropes this morning." "My pleasure," he said. "Thanks for lunch." Melts nodded. "We must come here again," she said. The waiter came back with her card and a receipt for her to sign, and a moment or so later they were outside on the pavement. Paul's legs still felt distinctly wobbly, but he ignored them. He came with her as far as the door of the cashier's office, then muttered something about some bits and pieces he had to see to, and turned away. "See you later," she called after him. He stopped but didn't look round. "You're coming with me to the bank, remember?" "Oh, all right. See you then." He'd forgotten about that little chore. Not something to look forward to, not terribly romantic. Even he couldn't visualise himself strolling hand in hand with her through the featureless darkness of the kingdom of the dead. Still, Paul realised that he'd stopped, for some reason he couldn't fathom, outside the door of the closed file store. It was a spooky sort of place at the best of times, and ever since the weird episode with the bicycle, he'd steered well clear of it. Now, however, he felt an odd urge to push the door open and go in. He fought it down, but as he walked away he was aware of a feeling both familiar and unexpected. Guilt, as though he'd just turned his back on a friend in need. Having nowhere else to go, he went back to his office. The door was open. Countess Judy was sitting at the desk, in Sophie's old chair. "There you are," she said, frowning a little. Sorry," Paul said automatically. Have you been waiting?" A tiny head gesture on her part indicated that it wasn't important. "Presumably you've been briefing Miss Horrocks about running the cashier's office." He nodded. "That's all right, isn't it?" he added. "You said—" "Perfectly all right," she replied. "Thank you. However, if you have a moment—" Bugger, Paul thought. "It's not dangerous, is it?" he said quickly. "Because I think I've done something to my hand and—" She shook her head. "Not dragons," she replied, with a faint smirk. "Nothing like that. Christine needs someone to help her move a filing cabinet, that's all." Ah! It was a mark of how jangled Paul's brain had become that it took him a moment to remember who Christine was. Mr. Tanner's secretary. Efficient woman. Talked a lot. "No problem," he said. "I'll get on it right away." "Splendid." Countess Judy stood up. "And when you've done that, you might care to spend a few minutes reviewing the chapter in the procedures manual about baiting chimeras. A client faxed us this morning asking for advice on how to deal with them. And don't forget," she added, "about the banking." "No, Mum," Paul thought, and set off for Christine's room. "Mind the paint," Christine said for the 7th time. Paul nodded, too exhausted to apologise. The cabinet was heavy. He wasn't used to hard physical labour, and the room was too damn small anyhow. "No, doesn't look like it's going to fit. Try it the way you had it the first time." He'd assumed it'd be easy, now that he could use magic, but it wasn't allowed. Apparently the cabinet had been festooned with filing charms, so all you had to do was open a drawer at random and drop in a piece of paper, and when you looked for it next, it'd be in the right folder, in alphabetical order, neatly tagged with the rest of the bundle. The charms didn't work, of course. No force on earth, natural or supernatural, can keep stored paperwork from reverting to a state of chaos. But once they'd been applied, they couldn't be removed, and they didn't mix well when played nicely with any other forms of magic. Using telekinesis on a charmed cabinet would assuredly have all sorts of blood-curdling side effects, hence the need for boring old human muscle. "That'll have to do," Christine said eventually. "Right, thanks. You better get on and do the banking. Don't want Mr. Tanner getting all upset, do we?" Too bloody right we don't, Paul thought, and he scampered down the stairs to the cashier's office. While he'd been playing with office furniture, Meltz had sorted out the overcrowded in-tray, done all the reconciliations, fed all the totals into the computer, tidied the windowsill, and done something subtle but effective with her hair. Paul didn't understand that sort of thing, but the net result made him forget what it was he was going to say and walk into the edge of the desk. "Oh, is it that time already?" Melz looked at him, and he saw a shadow of apprehension in her eyes. "It probably sounds a bit feeble, but I'm not looking forward to this." Paul grinned. "Me neither, but it's not nearly as scary as it looks. Look, do as I do and don't look around. Oh, and don't talk to anybody except Mr. Dow. He's the cashier, and whatever you do, don't let them get you a cup of tea. That's really important, okay?" She nodded. "I think so," she said. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be." "Fine." Paul started flipping back bolts and turning keys. "You'll soon get the hang of it," he said in a hollow voice. "All right, then. On 3. 1, 2... He took a long, deep breath, checked his pocket to make sure the baseball cap was there, and stepped through the door. On the other side was that same total absence of light and colour that he remembered so clearly. Odd that the essence of nothing could be etched so vividly into his mind. This time, though, it was perceptibly colder. He could feel pain in his knuckles and toe joints, and a harsh pressure on either side of his head. He didn't dare call out, "This way," or "Keep up," let alone turn round to see if Meltz was there. That made him feel bad, because surely it was his duty to protect her, but he rationalised it wouldn't do either of them any good if he broke the rules and got trapped in here forever. At least the dead seemed glad to see him. Distant cousins and venerable friends of the family, who'd never had a civil word for him while he was alive, came bustling up through the darkness to greet him. Ignoring them was easy enough, since he'd never had anything to say to them while they'd been alive. After a while, they gave up and drifted away. He didn't like to think what Mel's was going through. For all he knew, she'd lost people she genuinely cared for, which would make ignoring them very hard indeed. Today's blood sacrifice was the usual. Rabbit out of a hat. Paul had tried his best not to think about it all day, and that had only made it worse. He'd never actually tried doing the conjuring trick, since that would have involved admitting to himself that at some stage he was going to have to do this terrible thing. A substantial part of him was hoping that when he unfolded the baseball cap and felt inside it, there'd be nothing there, in which case, he hoped, he could just turn around and go back. But as soon as he thrust in his fingers, they connected with soft, sleek fur. Bugger, he thought. True, it wasn't the first time he'd killed something. He'd sat on a wyvern, so there was already blood on his hands, or on some part of his anatomy. Even so, Paul got a grip on what felt revoltingly like a teddy bear's paw and heaved. Out came the rabbit, squealing and thrashing, and he discovered that he was holding it by one hind leg. Cursing himself, the rabbit, and the world in general, he fumbled in his other pocket for the knife. It was there, but it had managed to get wedged underneath his bunch of keys, and the keys had poked their way through the pocket lining. Not now, he thought bitterly as he tugged. Please, not now, this isn't a good time. Then something whacked him hard on the nose. He reared back, but not far enough. The rabbit's free hind legs sucked him again, this time scrabbling across his top lip. His hands automatically let go, and the rabbit arched its back and kicked furiously in mid-air before landing on all fours and scooting away out of sight. He opened his mouth to swear and thought better of it, and then he recognised a coppery taste in his mouth. Blood. Nosebleed. Good afternoon. Mr. Dow was standing beside him. Thank you, he added, bowing gracefully. A rare treat. We are most grateful. Paul stared at him in horror as a drip of blood trickled down his chin and fell away. I didn't mean, he mumbled. Accident, the rabbit. No doubt. There was a flicker of amusement in Mr. Dow's deep eyes. There is a saying on your side of the divide, I believe. Never work with children and animals. You're obviously a brave man. He licked his lips like a cat. To business, he said. The cheques to be paid in. Right. Paul shivered and reached behind him. Someone, presumably Melts, put a wad of papers into his hand, and he passed them over. Mr. Dow took them from him and bowed again. Mr. Dow was looking past him. Your assistant, presumably, he said. Perhaps you would care to introduce me. Cursing himself for his carelessness, Paul muttered, Demelza Horrocks, she's standing in for Benny Shumway. Just showing her how it's done. Delighted, said Mr. Dow. You probably can't imagine how great a pleasure it is for us to see new faces here. Especially, he added with a dignified smile, such a charming face as this. Would Miss Horrocks care for a cup of... No, Paul growled, and I've told her so. Mr. Dow shrugged. Naturally, he said. You must excuse the lapse. Now, unless there's any further business. Paul shook his head, and Mr. Dow abruptly vanished, leaving no trace that he'd been there at all. Paul stood still for a moment. He very much wanted to throw up, but he reckoned that he'd been far too liberal with his bodily fluids already. He swallowed a couple of times, then slowly turned round. The feeling of nausea stayed with him until the last bolt had been fastened and the last key turned. Sorry, he said, finally daring to look and see if Melts was there. It's not usually that bad. It was my fault. She was looking puzzled. What was bad about that? She said. Paul opened his mouth, but no words came out. All right, she was saying. It's a bit of a chore, but what the hell, it's at the office. Why are you looking at me like that? But Paul narrowed his eyes. Melts was still looking at him as though there was something she'd missed. What exactly did you see in there? He asked. The question clearly puzzled her. Well, she said, we went through the door, and then we were in this long corridor with carpet and doors on either side, fire extinguishers, the usual stuff. Then we crossed a courtyard and you knocked on a door, and this nice old Chinese bloke opened it. Then you gave him the cheques and he asked if I'd like a cup of tea. You said no, which is fair enough. I mean, we got things we need to be getting on with. We can't be sitting around drinking tea all day. And then we came back and that's it. Oh, Paul said. That's... He didn't know what to say. That's all right then. Only, I get claustrophobic in long, narrow corridors. I thought you might too. Melt shook her head. "It's sweet of you to be concerned," she said, "but I'm all right like that. It's heights I can't be doing with, so I'm glad there wasn't any stairs or anything." You didn't see—" As he heard himself say the words, he wished he hadn't spoken. "You didn't see any rabbits, anything like that?" Her expression was a study in bewilderment. "Rabbits?" He nodded. "White rabbits." "I see," she laughed a little. "You mean great big white ones in waistcoats with watches saying, 'Oh, my ears and whiskers.' Yes, it was a bit like that, wasn't it? All those doors and stuff." Paul could have probably found an excuse to hang around the cashier's office for a bit. Judging by Meltz's expression when he excused himself and left, maybe she was expecting him to. But he wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. There was, he told himself as he clumped slowly down the stairs, an obvious explanation, if only he wasn't too stupid to figure it out. Clearly she hadn't seen the same things as he had. Perhaps it was a magic thing. Perhaps you only saw the nothingness and the blood and heard the dead relatives if you had the magical knack. Melts didn't, so maybe she saw some kind of interdimensional screensaver put there so that the paranormally challenged wouldn't realise where they were and start panicking. That made sense, surely? Paul stopped. Something had caught his eye. He looked around, but everything seemed to be as close to normal as it ever was. Paranoia, he told himself. A great excuse, but a lousy lifestyle. It made sense, all right. It made sense of a whole lot of things. For the last few hours, he'd been trying hard not to think about the sudden and savage jolt of pain he'd felt when Mel's had touched his hand, because there was a limit to how much bewilderment he could handle at any one time. And this instinct was to ignore the thing that disturbed him the most. But suppose it was a condition of this magical stuff, that people who had it were confined, where what the TV chat shows called interpersonal relationships are concerned, to their own kind. It wasn't the first time he'd touched a girl, after all, but Sophie had been one of us, and Melt's wasn't. A great deal might be accounted for in these terms. Wouldn't it be interesting and convenient if he could dump the blame for his pathetic record in matters of true love on the sneaky little sorcery gene? If there was some sort of inbuilt defence mechanism in his genetic whatchamacallit to stop him forming attachments with people who couldn't do magic. And he could explain why the defences had lapsed long enough for Melt to get to the point of buying him lunch. She was spending all her time in a magic environment, and as far as those pesky genetic watchdogs were concerned, she probably smelt of the stuff long enough to slip past the perimeter defences. How about that for a theory, huh? As Paul developed and refined his shiny new hypothesis, it did occur to him that pretty well every such rationalisation he'd come up with since joining J.W.W. had turned out to be hopelessly wrong. Even so, at some point, he was bound to figure something out right. Question was, did he want this to be that one time? If it transpired that he couldn't touch Melts without feeling as though he'd put his fingers in a coffee grinder, was that a good thing or a bad thing? Good question. He'd reached the bottom of the central staircase and was about to turn left down the corridor that led to his office. Something was wrong. That wasn't as unusual or as scary as all that. Paul knew, though he'd never actually done a scientific test, that the number of steps in the central staircase varied. Some days there were more than others. That was fine. The geography of 70 St Mary Axe was beguilingly flexible. Rooms came and went, or moved, like sunflowers, to catch the daylight, with an attendant saving electricity that no doubt delighted Mr. Tanner. He'd heard it said that Humphrey Wells, a disgraced ex-partner now serving the firm in the capacity of Xerox machine, was in the habit of shortening corridors when he was running late for a meeting, sometimes forgetting to put them back again afterwards. Logically, if rooms appeared or vanished, the staircases would have to be edited accordingly, or else they'd overrun or fall short. Likewise, it was wildly rumoured that when Countess Judy and the creative and media department held a meeting with their opposite numbers from another firm or organisation, the resulting build-up of superheated glamour had a nasty tendency to leak into the environment, changing the colours and textures of curtains, carpets, wallpaper, and other glamour-sensitive fixtures, and spontaneously creating constable prints and trailing maidenhair ferns. All that sort of thing he'd learned to take in his stride or ignore, just as he no longer needed to remember to keep his hands and the end of his tie at least 18 inches from the teeth of the shredder when it was switched on, if nobody had used it for a day or so. This thing he'd noticed coming down the stairs and now at the foot of them was something else. and that was probably bad. Then he saw it. Leaning against a wall, butter wouldn't melt in its saddlebags, was the bicycle that had accosted him in the closed file store. Staring at it now, he began to remember seeing it about the place on other occasions, before it had spoken to him. But of course he'd assumed then that it was just somebody's bike, an ecologically friendly alternative to tubes and taxis. He thought for a moment, and then turned to face it. Are you following me? Paul said. Silence. Ridiculous, he said to himself. I'm talking to a bicycle. Well, he said. Yes, the bicycle replied. He thought about that. It was old and battered, but it was a rally, good, long-established British make. You ought to be able to take its word at face value. Why? He asked. You've got to let her go. Do you understand? You've got to. It's not right. Paul frowned. That's what you told me the last time, right? Yes. Oh, well, thanks for being consistent anyway. Don't try being funny with us. Let her go, or we'll kill you. That's a promise. Oh, for pity's sake, Paul sighed. Just for once, can't somebody explain around here? Who have I got to let go? Just tell me, please. You know, the bike answered sullenly. Don't pretend you don't. It won't save you. Suddenly, Paul felt very tired. Humour me, he said. Look, if you care enough about this person to kill me, surely it's not too much trouble just to say her name, right? Silence. You can sometimes gauge the flavour of silences by how long they last. In this case, it tasted like embarrassment. Oh, we can't, said the bicycle. Sorry, you can't what? Say names, the bicycle replied awkwardly. We just can't, that's all. But you know who we mean. No, I bloody don't, Paul wailed. Come on, he went, forcing himself to get a grip. Don't give up on me. Give me a clue. How'd it be if I said some names and you answered yes or no? No names, grunted the bicycle. Was it just possibly scared? We don't hold with them, and besides, you... I know, right? Only I don't. Okay, how about descriptions? You know, old, young, height, hair colour, glasses or no glasses. Now, the bike sounded palpably uncomfortable. That wouldn't help. We do not understand the appearances. We deal only in essentials. We cannot see, it concluded painfully. Oh, Paul said. I'm sorry. Hang on, he thought. It was threatening me. Where does it say in the rules that I've got to be an equal opportunities victim? Well, there must be something. I mean, you can recognise me, right? How do you do that? By essentials, the bicycle told him, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. We would know you in any place, any time, in any guise, and if you don't let her go, we will hunt you down. Yes, fine, Paul snapped. Let's try it your way, shall we? What are the essentials of this person I've got to let go? Pause, as though the bike was marshalling its thoughts. Waterfalls, it said, a suddenness. The urgency dwindles as the perception broadens, but gold is soft under the hammer. A Wednesday at the end of a long alley of darkness. Her hair like water lilies, like sharp edges brittle. A thrice-used tissue tucked into a sleeve. And then, forever. Paul counted to 5 and then said, You what? You heard us, the bicycle growled at him. You must let her go immediately, or she will die, and so will you. We will kill you, because you will not suffer yourself to live. You will ask us to kill you, and we will oblige. Really? Yes. Great. Paul took a deep breath, then smiled. Jones, he said. The bicycle wobbled slightly. Do not attempt. Parkinson, Sinclair, Cohen, Ivanovich, Rashid, Banerjee. Traitor, we defy you. Paul sighed. Lennon, he said. McCartney, Harrison, Starr. He grinned. Rumpelstiltskin. With a scream, the bicycle sprang away from the wall and reared up on its back wheel. For a split second, Paul was convinced that it was about to charge him, and then it crashed down onto 2 wheels, backpedaled frantically, and shot away backwards down the passage that led, more often than not, to the stationery cupboard. Paul was too weary to do anything more energetic than shrug. You had, he decided, to take the broad view in these matters. Death threats from a blind push-bike that scarpered like buggery when he recited the names of the Beatles were probably the least of his problems. Even so, you must let her go immediately or she will die. He didn't really want to have to worry about that, but he had a feeling he was going to. All he'd managed to find out, he realised, was that this person he had to let go was female. Let go? But I can't let anybody go. I'm not holding anybody. Am I? He thought about that as he sat at his desk, waiting for it to be 5:30. Am I holding anybody, he wondered. Not in the way you'd normally understand it, but in some other way. Who am I connected to who's female? Fortunately, the gender thing made it easier. For various reasons, Paul simply didn't know a lot of women. Let's see, he thought. There's Melts and Sophie, except she left me. Does that count as letting her go? There's Mum, but she's in Florida. Countess Judy. Or what about Mr. Tanner's mum? Or Monica? She's being held, sure enough. And where she is, there's every chance she could die. But there's absolutely nothing I can do about that. Who else? Christine? A thrice-used tissue tucked into a sleeve. And then forever. Well, that could be any one of them, obviously. Unless the thrice-used tissue bit was some sort of subtle, riddling metaphor. He thought about that and decided he really didn't want it to be. Ugh, in fact. He remembered that he was supposed to be reading up on chimeras, and then it was 5:25. Long day. When he got home, he'd have a leisurely bath and an early night, because it was only yesterday that he'd been trapped in the dungeons of the Fae with two people he'd somehow resigned himself to never seeing again. He thought about that. Probably a good thing, he told himself, that I can do that. It's probably a knack or a survival instinct. Soldiers in war must be able to do it when their friends are suddenly killed in the middle of battle. What if I were to quit? What could Mr. Tanner actually do to me that'd be worse than this? Turn me into something nasty and inhuman? Seems to me I'm doing a pretty good job of that on my own. His hand, Paul realised, was in his jacket pocket and had found something. A matchbox. He wondered what on earth it was doing there. Then remembered. It seemed so long ago now. The day he'd sat on the funny little dragon, and Mr. Tanner's mum had scooped the little red jewel out of the poor dead bugger's brains. It shows you stuff you can't normally see, she told him. If you practice, you can learn to see useful things. Otherwise, it just shows you your own true love, so it's a bit wasted on you. Nearly 5:30. He ought to be making a move, but he slid the matchbox open and took out the stone. It lay on his palm, glowing faintly red, and then green, like a small piece of gravel from the planet Krypton. If I practice, he told himself, I'll learn to see useful things. Otherwise, the stone was looking back at him. A neat trick for something with no eyes. He could feel it, scanning him, downloading his thoughts, deciding something. Where do you want to go stay? Paul sat up a little bit straighter. I'd like to see something useful, please, he said. The stone grew, from a loose chipping to a potato, to a basketball, to a boulder that filled all the space between floor and ceiling, until it was so big he couldn't see it any more. The green glow was warm, and crackled softly with static. Please wait. I'd like to see something useful, he thought. I'd like to see if Monica and Benny are all right. I'd like to see why touching Mel's hurts so much. I'd like to see what I've become, and why that bloody bicycle's threatening to kill me. I'd like to see why my parents went off to Florida without me, and if you happen to do winning lottery numbers, that'd be pretty useful too. The green light went black, so black that Paul thought for a moment that he was back in the dungeon. Before he could work up a really good head of panic, however, light seeped in from the edges, crawled and trickled inwards in white swirls and worm casts, until the only black left was letters on a page of writing. Chimeras for Dummies, it read. Chapter 1. Big scary monsters with teeth, and that's why they're sometimes bad news. Oh, thank you so much, Paul muttered, closing his hand around the stone. The writing vanished. The world came back, and he put the stone away in the matchbox and closed the lid.